The world is facing a plastic pollution crisis. Plastic consumption and production have reached unsustainable levels, with plastic consumption quadrupling over the past 30 years. Primary plastics, such as nurdles, are available in abundance at a low cost for manufacturers of plastic products, and the amount of primary plastic available is expected to triple by 2060. Only a small fraction of new plastic products are produced from recycled content due to poor quality, lack of availability, and high costs. The production of primary plastic polymers relies heavily on fossil-based sources, contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. Without action, plastic consumption and plastic waste are also projected to nearly triple by 2060. Even though we can recycle some plastic waste, today we only recycle 9%. Our waste management and recycling systems cannot handle current levels of plastic waste, let alone future growth. The High Ambition Coalition to End Plastic Pollution is committed to developing an ambitious international, legally binding instrument to end plastic pollution by 2040. The Plastics Treaty should require countries to take effective measures to restrain the production of primary plastic polymers within a set time frame and to stimulate a market for secondary plastics. These could include administrative measures, bans, removal of subsidies, and regulations. Parties should agree on robust and comprehensive minimum reporting requirements for plastic polymer production and chemical additives used in the production. Let's end plastic pollution by 2040.
Dear colleagues, welcome to this webinar on what we can do in the context of the new treaty on plastic pollution to reduce plastic production and consumption. This webinar is organized by the government of Rwanda with support from the High Ambition Coalition to End Plastic Pollution. My name is Magnus Lobel. I'm affiliated with the Norwegian Academy of International Law, and I will, to the best of my abilities, take you through today's meeting. I hope you can all hear me well. We have a high number of people in the audience and a distinguished panel of speakers with us today, and the speakers that you can see on your screen and who have kindly agreed to share their wisdom with us include Juliet Kebera. She's the Director General of the Rwanda Environment Management Authority. She's also one of the co-chairs of the High Ambition Coalition. You saw her here on this movie that we just saw. We have with us Ed Shepard. He's the Senior Global Sustainability Manager on Circular Economy at Unilever, also a member of the Business Coalition for a Global Plastics Treaty. We have with us Bethany Carney-Almroth. She's a professor at the Department of Biological and Environmental Sciences at the University of Gothenburg. We have Sulan Chen, a Principal Technical Advisor and Global Lead on Plastics at the United Nations Development Programme. And last but not least, Tim Grabiel is the Senior Lawyer and Policy Advisor at the Environmental Investigation Agency. Thank you all so much for being with us today. We would like today's event to be as dynamic and interactive as possible. Should you in the audience wish to make any comments or ask questions to any of our speakers, please write your question in the Q&A box. And if in the Q&A you should wish to take the floor, please use the raise hand function. And then I will ask the panelists to address these comments and questions in due course. But first of all, and before anything else, I'm pleased now to give the floor to Erlend Arneson Haugen, is coordinator of the High Ambition Coalition to End Plastic Pollution at the Royal Norwegian Embassy in Nairobi, for some opening remarks. Erlend, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Magnus, and welcome everyone to this webinar hosted by the High Ambition Coalition to End Plastic Pollution and the government of Rwanda. So this event is the first of many in a series of High Ambition Coalition webinars leading up to the INC2 on options for elements in the plastics treaty. And as Magnus said, we are really hoping to get into the details in these events. But first, allow me just to give a quick introduction to the coalition. The High Ambition Coalition is co-chaired by the Minister of Norway, Espen Barth Eide, and Minister Mujawa Maria of Rwanda. And it was announced during the UN Environment Assembly in Nairobi following the adoption of the historic resolution 5/14 and plastic pollution. And then the coalition was launched officially during the UN General Assembly in September 2022. The coalition currently has 51 members from all regions of the world. Our common ambition is to end plastic pollution by 2040 through 3 strategic goals and 7 key deliverables for success. The coalition meets both on ministerial level and on negotiator level to identify common priorities and key messages, and also to develop ministerial joint statements ahead of the meetings. And ahead of the next International Intergovernmental Negotiation Committee meeting in Paris, the co-chairs, Rwanda and Norway of the coalition, submitted a written submissions on potential options for elements towards an international legally binding instrument. And they proposed 4 categories of provisions in the plastics treaty. First, provisions to reduce production of primary plastic polymers, which we are here to discuss today. Second, provisions to eliminate and restrict specific plastic polymers, chemicals, and plastic products of concern. And thirdly, provisions to increase circularity of plastics in the economy. And fourth, provisions on eliminating the release of plastics to the air, water, and land. But here we are today to discuss in more detail the potential provisions to reduce the production of primary plastics polymers. And as you saw in the video, the background is that plastic consumption and production already have reached unsustainable levels, while production is expected to double in the next 20 years. And waste generation and release of plastics will follow suit, as the world will not be able to handle that amount. So the co-chairs then propose measures and targets for keeping the supply of primary plastic polymers within sustainable levels are needed to reduce plastic pollution. In addition, it will be necessary to develop markets for non-toxic secondary materials, and measures to reduce production of plastic polymers will also complement efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And in their submission, the co-chairs present possible options for the treaty. The first is a general obligation that each party should be required to take effective measures to reduce the production of primary plastic polymers to an agreed level to reach a common target. And these measures could be taxes, tariffs, fees, permits, licenses, bans, and regulations, and removal of subsidies. And secondly, on transparency, each party should be required to report on the quantities and type of plastic polymers produced, as well as the quantities and types of chemicals in production. So these are the co-chair's submission. That's just the starting point for our discussion here today. The co-chair submission presents a variety of options for obligations and control measures as identified by the members of the High Ambition Coalition, and does not represent an agreed or exhaustive list of measures. And on the similar note, in this webinar series, we will have several coalition members, member states participating in this webinar series, and they may present national views or regional views, and may also refer to the common positions by the coalition. So that's just the background, and I very much look forward to the discussion and hand it over back to Magnus. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Alan, for providing us with that good starting point for discussion, as you said, and to indeed start our discussion and complement what you said just now. I'm now pleased to turn to you and introduce you, Juliet, and bring you into the discussion. Thank you, first of all, so much for being with us today. And I think that many that have followed this issue for some time have noted that the scope of international discussions about plastic pollution has been expanded in important ways since the resolution on marine litter and microplastics was adopted at the UN Environment Assembly in 2014. That's nearly 10 years ago, and thinking about how far we've come in those 10 years. I think the submissions the Hague submission that Alan mentioned, but also submissions made by other states and stakeholders to the second session of the Intergovernmental Negotiation Committee in Paris in a couple of months. These submissions reflect really, in my reading, broad support for the inclusion of significant upstream control measures, including measures to reduce the total production and consumption of plastic. And Juliette, what does this sort of move up the stream say about the direction and potential of the negotiation process that is now well underway? And why, in your opinion, is it important that the new treaty include measures to reduce the total production and consumption of plastics? Please, Juliette, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Magnus. Greetings from the northern part of Rwanda. I'm connecting from very far. I pray that you can hear me okay. Kindly confirm.
We can hear you loud and clear, Juliette.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you once again for joining us for this important discussion on how we can reduce the amount of plastic we produce and consume. You talked about the change of scope, which we very much welcome, because for us, it represents an evolution of our collective understanding of the scope of the problem and how to meaningfully address it. It's important to begin by reminding ourselves of the scope of the problem. Plastic consumption has quadrupled over the past 30 years. Without action, plastic pollution is set to double over the next 20 years and triple by 2060. It's clear that plastic production and consumption have reached unsustainable levels. It is no secret that we are already failing to deal with the problem of plastic pollution, and this increase will only make our work to protect human health and the planet much harder, if not impossible. The massive increase in plastic pollution and its negative impacts are what have compelled the international community to look for a sustainable solution. Indeed, a set of solutions that are holistic and target the full life cycle of plastics, that is from source to pollution, cradle to grave, if you like. If we were to take a business as usual approach, ending plastic pollution would likely become an attainable goal. Yet another planetary crisis our generation would have failed to address. That is why a timely and ambitious global plastic treaty is so critical. It will reduce current and future environment damages and ensure that plastics being produced are done so with the highest environmental standards. The numbers do not lie. Since 1950, 9.2 billion tons of plastic waste have been generated, out of which less than 10% have been recycled. Around 15% has been incinerated, with the other 76% being disposed of in landfills or released into the environment. We have always maintained that the marine environment will never be protected from plastic pollution until all environments are protected from plastic pollution. With the adoption of the resolution 15/14, we believe this understanding is now shared. Many countries around the world, including Rwanda, have put in place measures to control plastic pollution. Despite this, we are still facing the overwhelming tide of plastics due to the lack of control measures at the source of the problem. Thus, the problem and its solution is directly connected to unsustainable production and consumption of plastics. To find a sustainable long-term solution, it is important for the international community to design a global plastic treaty with core obligations and control measures for each stage of the plastic life cycle, starting at the beginning and working our way down. This will be possible if the instrument includes measures on plastic production and consumption. One that is complemented by measures on product design and waste management, basically a full life cycle approach. For this reason, we need a treaty with co-obligations and control measures at the upstream on plastic production when plastic first comes into existence as a material. Firstly, we must have mandatory reporting on plastic production and consumption. It is often said that we cannot manage what we can't measure. Secondly, we must eliminate from production those problematic polymers that are toxic or hazardous, virtually impossible to recycle in the environmental sound manner, or those for which substitutes are available. In this way, we can reduce the complexity of the problem, make sure manageable and plastics is in circulation. Thirdly, for those polymers we do use, we must set limits on their production at sustainable levels. In this way, we can reduce the size of the problem. Such limits also have important implication further downstream, such as ensuring that the efficient use of plastics in our economy, promoting reusable systems and substitutes, and enhancing the economics of collection and recycling. This approach is not unlike that taken under the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer, widely considered the most successful international environment agreement in the world. It is worth being inspired by the approach taken there. And my hope is that countries will realize that this does portend an end of plastic producers, but instead, just like producers of ozone depleting substances became part of the solution in healing the ozone layer, plastic producers can become part of the solution in addressing plastic pollution. If we have the resolve to take meaningful action, I'm confident that we will avoid future leakage of plastic waste into marine and terrestrial environments, and by turning down the tap, enable ourselves to deal with legacy plastics already damaging life and polluting our planet. Thank you once again, and looking forward to continued discussions.
Thank you so much for that, Juliette, for those brilliant remarks, and also those inspiring words there about what can be achieved through this treaty that is now being negotiated. And I think I would also like to thank you and also Rwanda for the great leadership that you have shown and continue to show in this process. I would like now to turn to our brilliant panel, Ed, Bethany, Sulan, and Tim. And I know that you have all, over the past years and maybe even decades, thought hard about how a new treaty on plastic pollution may help reduce the total production and consumption of plastics. And you have yourself contributed to several of the stakeholder submissions made to the second round of negotiations in Paris. And I would like now to propose that we do a sort of a quick tour around the table and ask all of you briefly to tell us what, in your view, is the single most important measure or the single most important obligation that this new treaty should contain to achieve a reduction in the production and consumption of plastics. So I'd like maybe to turn first to you, Ed, to hear your response to that question. So over to you.
Yes, thanks, Magnus, and hello, everyone. So I'm here representing both Unilever, a global consumer goods company that is a significant user of plastic. We use around 700,000 tons of plastic every year, and the Business Coalition for a Global Plastics Treaty. And Unilever is a member of the Business Coalition alongside over 80 other businesses from across the value chain. I'm just quickly going to share my screen. So the Business Coalition firmly believes in the reduction agenda. We know we cannot recycle our way out of the plastic pollution crisis. We already know that existing waste management facilities cannot cope with the current levels of plastic waste, and we will not be able to scale these facilities quickly enough to meet even the short-term requirements. If we want to end plastic pollution, the treaty must therefore deliver a reduction of plastic production and use through a circular economy approach, focusing on those plastics that are short-lived and made using fossil-based virgin resources. So why does business believe in policy interventions on reduction? Well, the availability and low price of virgin plastic hampers business efforts to achieve circularity. It prevents businesses from scaling the use of recycled content, transitioning to alternative formats, and ultimately, it's a significant barrier to business models based on reuse or the collection and recycling of plastic. And this affects businesses of all sizes. Seeking to deliver sustainable business growth will remain a challenge if virgin plastic production and use continues unchecked. And we already have voluntary commitments in this area. For example, Unilever has committed to halve its use of virgin plastic by 2025, but it is clear that voluntary initiatives alone will not go fast or far enough to solve the problem. And so with the supply of virgin plastic set to double by 2040, policy interventions in the form of common, globally binding control measures are required to level the playing field and align incentives towards the future that we want. On your question on the most important upstream control measure, it's really important to start with what's practical, which is the elimination of certain problematic plastics. So the treaty must set a timeline for the phasing out of problematic plastic materials, components, and additives, those that hinder progress towards a circular economy. They might do this because they are hard to recycle, or perhaps they have a high likelihood of leaking into the environment. And businesses are already voluntarily doing this. Through the Ellen MacArthur Foundation UNEP Global Commitment, businesses have already agreed to eliminate certain types or formats of plastic packaging. We already have practical examples of moving away from these problematic plastics. For example, eliminating the use of PVC within consumer packaging. Now, beyond this elimination piece, we will likely need further control measures on both the demand side interventions, for example, rules around PCR inclusion in consumer packaging, and potentially on supply side interventions also. And these will likely be needed to ensure the treaty ends plastic pollution and also supports sustainable business growth. So thank you, and the attendees can find out more about the Business Coalition at the link on the screen.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Ed. Very clear recommendation about what the treaty should contain. Now I'd like to turn to you, Bethany, and ask you essentially the same question. I know you have many thoughts about what this treaty should contain, but what is the single most important aspects in your view? Over to you.
Yeah, I can answer that question pretty quickly with one word, and that word is minimization. But before I get into it, I just want to thank you for inviting me to be here. I'm very happy to be here and happy for everyone who's listening. And I also wanted to let you know that in addition to being a professor of ecotoxicology, I've been working on plastics for 12 to 13 years. I'm also a member of the Scientists Coalition for an Effective Plastics Treaty. We're a group of almost 200 different scientists, plastic experts with diverse expertise, and we're located around the world, so we have a lot of different kinds of knowledge. And our goal is to bring this expert knowledge, our robust and independent science, to the treaty negotiations to help support evidence-based decision-making. And given that, I would like to share my slides and just bring you some figures showing how we understand the environmental impacts of plastic pollution. And this is from a paper that we published last year. And this image that you see on your screen is from the Planetary Boundaries Framework, which is a framework that helps us to understand how human activities are affecting the planet. And this is looking at things like climate change and biodiversity loss and land and water usage and so on. But we were focusing on novel entities, this down in the bottom corner, which is new things that humans made. And we were addressing then chemicals and plastics. And by looking through the entire life cycle of chemicals and plastics, from extraction to production of the polymers and chemicals to the products and their leakage pathways into the environment and impacts they might be having, we understood that we have moved outside of the safe operating space. So we have produced numbers and volumes of plastics and chemicals that are beyond what the planet can tolerate. And we are also unable to mitigate risks or harm to the environment because the production rates are outpacing our ability to understand toxicity and find mechanisms to prevent that. And if we put plastics in the center, as you see here, so plastics and the chemicals inherent to plastics, we can see the connections from plastics to the other planetary boundary functions. So we can understand, based on other research, how plastics can affect climate change through the release of greenhouse gases, through particles and albedo, through changes in carbon sequestration. We can see how plastics can affect biosphere integrity or biodiversity loss through toxicity mechanisms, through disruptions of ecosystems, through spread of invasive species, and so on and so forth. So this is sort of an image showing our collective knowledge of how plastics are affecting the environment. And given this knowledge, we understand that plastics are, I can stop sharing my screen now, are being produced in volumes and complexities that are beyond what we can handle. So what we're saying is that we need to see a minimization, minimize the production levels, minimize the complexity, minimize the number of polymers on the market, the number of chemicals in plastics. Right now, that number is about 13,000. And to look for essential uses, take away all the unnecessary uses of chemicals and polymers and products to bring us back inside that safe operating space. And I think that was most definitely my 2 minutes. I'll stop there and happy to discuss more as we move on.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Bethany, and thank you also for introducing the Scientist Coalition. I see already that there are some questions here in the Q&A, which are of a rather scientific nature about how much oil is used to make plastic. So we may come back to some of these questions later on. Thank you so much. Same question to you, Sulan. UNDP, of course, is one of those that have submitted is used to these negotiation process. It would be very interesting to hear from you what you think is the single most important obligation or measure that this new treaty should contain. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Magnus, and thanks to High Ambition Coalition for inviting me to join this very important webinar to share UNDP's views that we have submitted in the INC submission. In our view, and I think I agree with the colleagues, Bethany and Ed, who have mentioned this important measure, the single most important measure is to minimize and phase out the production of virgin plastics and elimination of non-essential single-use plastics. It is simple as this: do not add new plastics to this planet. So the measure models after this, Juliet also mentioned that Montreal Protocol as a possible model. I think this measure models after the Montreal Protocol, which sets a maximum level of ozone depleting substance and gradually reduces it to a safe level, and the Paris Agreement that sets a goal in controlling the temperature rise, which mandates the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. The target should have very concrete and realistic timeline. The treaty should agree on a progressively decreasing global production allowance, and to align with climate change target of net zero emissions by 2050, production of virgin plastics should be phased out by a timeline to be decided by member states, probably aligning with the climate change target. By then, all plastic products, if needed, should be made from recycled plastics that have already been produced. Exceptions can be made for essential products such as medical equipment that no alternatives can be found. It may sound impossible to many, but remember, we only had plastics in the past 70, 80 years, and many of us didn't grow up with plastics. On the consumption side, the treaty should mandate elimination of non-essential single-use plastics and promote circular solutions that can support local livelihoods, particularly the development and the scaling up of ecological alternatives. Ed mentioned that the very cheap virgin plastics is a barrier to business to develop circular solutions. It's even a more challenging barrier to local economies and local livelihoods activities that can use local materials. So single-use plastics products that can be replaced with local ecological materials should be banned globally, with the possibility of boosting local economy with local solutions and alternatives. Circular solutions such as refills and reuse should be promoted to keep products in use as long as possible to reduce the demand for new plastic products. With the reduced use of plastics, the demand for virgin plastics can be reduced, which will reinforce the target of the reduction of global plastic production. So I stop here, Magnus, and happy to elaborate on the point later in the session. Thanks.
Brilliant. No, thank you so much for that, Sulan. That was excellent and gave, I think, great specificity to our discussion. I also see alignment here. There's it's resonating well what you're saying with both what Bethany and Ed said before. I would like to ask some follow-up questions, but before I do so, I'd like to bring in our last discussant and last panelist, Tim. Over to you. I know this is something that you've been thinking a lot about as well, and you've also submitted these views in writing. But if you were to, in 2-3 minutes, to say what is the most important things that governments need to do now in this treaty, what would it be?
Yes. Hello, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to participate. I find myself in agreement with the other speakers. To my mind, the most important measure we can adopt are supply side measures on virgin polymer production and consumption. So quantitative controls or limits on how much polymer production and consumption can happen. And I very much agree, and I would listen with great interest to the intervention by the distinguished delegate from Rwanda, who I have been inspired by for her clarity, her experience, and her ambition. And we very much find ourselves in alignment with the way that she articulated the problem. I mean, we need to address plastic when it comes into existence as a material. That's when it first enters the environment in the form of pollution, in the form of pellets or nurdles that make their way out of the production facilities, and during transport and during conversion. So if we're going to have some supply side controls on virgin polymer production, some quantitative limits of some sort, we're obviously going to need reporting. That is a foundational measure that's going to be required so that we can establish baselines and track progress and trends into the future. But then the way it was articulated is a way that we very much agree with. We need to both reduce the complexity of the problem and the size of the problem. On the complexity side, this means we do need to eliminate the problematic polymers. It was previously identified that those are ones that are either toxic or hazardous, virtually impossible to recycle in an environmentally sound manner. I definitely agree with that environmentally sound manner aspect, because a lot of plastics cannot be recycled in an environmentally sound manner, and for which substitutes are available. And so we have alternatives that are less pernicious for the environment and human health. So on the one hand, we have the elimination aspect, and I think this reduces the complexity of the problem. But then on the other hand, we are going to use plastics in some way or another. And I think this everyone recognizes, so we can move beyond the notion that we're going to get rid of all plastics and all uses. But for the plastics that we do use, we have way too many being produced. As mentioned before, they come more cheaply than secondary raw materials, recycled plastics. They undermine the economics in investing in separate collection and investing in recycling. And we need to be more resource efficient. So for the polymers that we do use, we should establish limits. Now that would presumably start with a freeze at some point. But then through assessment, it can entail some reduction to sustainable levels. And I think that's our ultimate objective, is to get plastic production down to sustainable levels and to use it efficiently. And that's what limits on polymer production and consumption would do. As mentioned before, this is similar to the approach taken in the Montreal Protocol. I've been a practitioner within the Montreal Protocol space for 15 years. We take much pride in our ability to address the problem upstream, and we have taken a start and strengthen approach. We do not need to have every control in place now, but we need to have the ability to adopt controls in the future as needed, as information comes to light. And so I'm very much a fan of being inspired by the Montreal Protocol, as I previously said. Now, I just want to say, although control measures on virgin polymer production and consumption obviously are sort of the critical, most important thing that we can do in this treaty, we also need to work methodically, down the life cycle. And so we are going to have measures on product design and use, plastic waste management and treatment, and legacy plastic pollution. So those will be a part of the solution. There is no one single measure that will fix everything. And then I also want to note that we should also work to eliminate the impacts to local communities living alongside the petrochemical and polymer producing facilities. For that's a toxic burden that no community should bear, and we don't want it to be overlooked in the context of this treaty. So I'll wrap it up quickly by saying the short answer is rather straightforward to my mind. The single most important measure to reduce polymer or plastic production and consumption are measures that actually control plastic production and consumption. And this we can do through a combination of elimination and limits. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Tim. A great, I think, great alignment in a sense in the views, and I think that's also something that we see to some extent in the submissions that have been made to the next round of negotiations. Very interesting to see. I'd like to turn back to you, Ed, and you mentioned the need for a timeline for the phasing out of problematic plastics, materials, components, and additives, and you also stressed the need for global or common globally binding control measures that will be required. And of course, in the context of these treaty negotiations, we're looking at developing international obligations. And I think we can take guidance to some extent from what has already been done at the national and regional levels. In addition, of course, to taking guidance and inspiration from how other issues have been regulated internationally in the past. But I'd like you to ask you, to what extent these sort of efforts to phase out problematic plastics, to what extent have these been tried and tested at national or regional level, and if they have, what has been the main challenges related to the implementation of these measures?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I would say that significant parts of industry are already working towards some of the kind of control measures that have been discussed by the panel today. For example, eliminating certain types of or uses of plastic, and also, reducing virgin plastic use, and particularly in the kind of idea of reducing consumption. There are already leading parts of industry that have made significant kind of headway on this topic. And I think there's a lot that can then be scaled into a policy context based on that learning. So, for example, there's 20% of global plastic packaging volumes now covered by the global commitment, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation UNEP Global Commitment. We know that plastic packaging is one of the main causes of plastic pollution. And so we've already got around a fifth of the industry aligned behind some common rules, some common goals, and that includes eliminating and having a timeline for eliminating certain types of plastic. That also includes a commitment around the reduction of virgin plastic. So all signatories to the global commitment have also made a commitment around reducing either total or your percentage of virgin plastic. And this has led to quite significant progress. So for Unilever, we've moved from 1% PCR, so post-consumer recycled plastic, in our packaging in 2018 to 21% in 2022. So in just 4 years, we've had a significant scale up. And I think it shows that these transitions are achievable and that we actually have many of the technical solutions already for these kind of transitions. What we don't have is this level playing field, this idea that kind of competing companies are subject to the same regulatory regime at both a national and an international level. And what that means is that all businesses don't currently benefit from the economies of scale that would come from mandatory control measures on reduction. And I think one of the real challenges within this space, and it's something that Tim alluded to, is the kind of lack of robust information on the current levels of plastic production and use and how it's managed across its life cycle. And this is where it would be important to establish globally harmonized monitoring and reporting obligations at both a country and a company level. And actually the global commitment has a version of this. There is a framework that businesses use to disclose their use of plastic and their progress towards their goals. And I'd really encourage those on the call to look at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, CDP and Minderoo joint submission to the INC2, which talks about this topic of a monitoring and reporting framework.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Ed. And I just want to quickly follow up. I know that you've been following this process quite closely for some time now. And, the case for international obligations on this seem very strong. But what still, I mean, there's a sort of one thing to make a case for something and actually getting it into the treaty. We have 2 years to negotiate this treaty, right? What is the sort of main challenges as you see in actually getting these obligations adopted into treaty text?
I mean, I'd say one of the main things that we're focused on in the Business Coalition is coming forward with the practical examples of what industry is already doing. You know, we really think this can offer kind of confidence and courage to policymakers and governments across the world that actually this is good for business. This doesn't just make sense to help deal with the environmental and social issues related to plastic pollution. This can also support and enhance business growth. And, you know, it can do that by creating this harmonized approach. So, you know, at the moment, as Unilever, we operate in over 190 countries. So we work across a range of different regulatory frameworks, targets, and obligations. And that's really the opportunity that we have here, is to illustrate to governments that, you know, as businesses, we support the idea of harmonization, that actually this can support businesses to grow and businesses of all sizes, because that's where we can achieve the economies of scale on some of the transitions that we're trying to achieve.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. I also want to follow up with you, Bethany, and your initial presentation. I think it's clear that this treaty process is motivated by a great concern with a huge environmental impact of plastic pollution. And of course, we hope that this treaty will help us, at least to some extent, solve this problem. So, and I think you know, from a scientist perspective, what is the expected environmental impact in positive terms of a reduction in plastic production or consumption, or minimization, as you put it?
Yeah, I think so. Our goal would be to pull us sort of back inside that safe operating space, and that we have to live in mannerisms that are sustainable on this very finite planet. So reducing consumption of natural resources, for example, and then reducing burdens on the environment through toxic chemicals and through plastic materials and particles. And one thing I'd like to address that I've seen come up in the questions a lot, and something that I think a number of the speakers have mentioned already, is recycling. And if we're going to reduce plastics production, we're going to need to find other ways to solve the problems that plastics are solving right now. And reduction is right there at the top of the waste hierarchy, and that has to be the absolutely first step. So we shouldn't always be replacing virgin plastic with something else. We should be reducing use. And there are a lot of non-essential uses that we can eliminate. For example, with some of the single-use plastics. Then we move down to reuse. And if we're moving into reuse, we have to make sure that the materials that we're using are sustainable, that they're non-toxic, they should be inert, that we have systems in place where we can collect those materials and make sure that we're able to reuse them as intended. And then comes recycling on the third step down. And if we're using recycled materials, we need to make sure that the products we have on the market are recyclable. And that is largely not the case right now. And we've heard the number 9%. I think that's the most accurate number that we have to date about the global recycling rate. And part of that is because products are not designed to be recyclable. And there are a lot of actors in the plastics value chain that are adding chemicals, and there's different polymers that are going into product designs. And we don't have transparency around that right now. So once we get to the end of life where a material might be recycled, it's a hot mess. There could be potentially thousands of chemicals in there, and many of them are toxic. They're toxic to our health, and they're toxic in the environment. So what we need to do is eliminate toxic chemicals, and we need to create cycles in our societies where we can reuse and recycle materials, where we have the right design to do that, and we have the right infrastructure to do that. So those are really important issues, I think. But the ultimate environmental impact should be that we move back into the safe operating space, that we have a clean, healthy, non-toxic environment, and then we're not harming human health through the production and use of plastics.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And I think also one thing that I wanted to ask you about, because I know you've done quite a lot of research on this, is that we hear sometimes, when someone proposes to reduce plastic production, we hear arguments that, well, this is just such a useful material, it's light, etc. And using, it will just, if you minimize that, it's just going to, use some other material, which is maybe has other problematic environmental impact. So I wanted to ask you, what is the risk of sort of this kind of problem shifting in the implementation of a minimization program, and how can we craft these measures that would help prevent such regrettable substitutions?
Yeah, this is where we can rely on science. And this is something that we've also been very good at historically. We identify a problem and then we replace it with something else that turns out to be a problem. So I think we need to be proactive. Before just replacing things, we need to understand what we're replacing them with. And by understanding the impacts on a systematic level, through looking at whole systems, we can understand if we're shifting a problem from one place to another. So we can understand if there's conflicts of interest between resources, for example, and how we're making our plastics, and that we're not causing problems with food security or with health issues. We want to make sure that we're not increasing greenhouse gas emissions while we're doing these things. And this is where we can look to science. We can look at the suggestions that are put forth. We can try to understand the potential impacts of those and make sure that we avoid regrettable substitutions. I mean, that's how we've been doing things for 100 years, and we have to stop. We're smarter than that now.
Brilliant, thank you. Let's hope so. Thank you for that, Bethany. I also want to turn back to you, Sulan, and from your perspective as a development organization. Of course, the mandate of the treaty negotiations that was adopted in Nairobi in March last year, which basically is the basis for everything we're doing now, it noted that the increasing levels of plastic pollution represent a serious environmental problem at a global scale, negatively impacting the environmental, social, and economic dimensions of sustainable development. Just wanted to ask you, from the perspective of UNDP, the UN Development Program, what would be the sort of expected development benefits of a sort of phase down or phase out measures on the production of plastics if they are implemented?
Thank you so much, Magnus. I think to keep it in a word, that all the negative costs or impacts that we have seen in the video and previously by our presented by panelists will be avoided if we have effective control measure. So direct development benefits include economic, social, environmental benefits of a clean planet without plastic pollution. If we continue the current trend of plastics production and consumption with a very high leakage rate, the annual flow of plastics into the ocean, as mentioned, will nearly triple by 2040, which is equivalent to 50 kilograms of plastics for every meter of coastline worldwide. 50 kilometers every year. So there are also the impact on climate change, on human health, and researchers estimated a loss of 1.5% in marine ecosystem services as a result of plastic pollution. And this reduction equals to a loss of about $500 billion to $2.5 trillion per year. And I think even though we always want to make an economic argument, but there are a lot of developmental impacts that cannot be measured in money in terms of loss of species, human health, and others. Human health-wise, studies show that we are eating a credit card worth of plastics every week, and the plastics are found in human placenta, having penetrated deepest to human bodies. Besides the physical health, spending time at littered coastlines has also been demonstrated to be detrimental to human mood and mental well-being. And psychology and behavioral science have documented that a dirty and littered environment is correlated with higher rates of crimes. And what we are seeing externally to the planet is basically a reflection of our internal human being, our internal situation. And I think this is quite worrisome. And that's why we need really to have very ambitious goal and measures in the treaty.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Sulan. And we got a question here in the Q&A box that I also wanted to just immediately field to you, because I think it's something that some people are concerned about. If you introduce this global production reduction on plastics, I think the expectation is that plastic products will be more expensive. They will be You know, they won't be as cheap maybe as they are today. So is there, you know, for countries that may rely on plastics for their economic development, won't there be a negative impact for them? This is a bit sort of critical question. So and I'm coming from the audience, but it will be interesting to have your perspective on that.
Thanks, Magnus. I want to also share my views here. Some argue that plastic production and consumption play an important role in economic development. And it is undeniable that plastic is a very useful, high quality and long-lasting material. And evidences show that plastic production and consumption are not proportionately correlated with economic growth. In another word, plastic production and consumption does not necessarily lead to fast economic growth. Just to give some data and information, according to OECD, plastic consumption grows 40% faster than economic growth. According to the American Plastics Industry Association, while the consumption of plastic products in the US increased 6.1% from 2017 to 2018, employment in the plastic industry grew only 0.28% annually. And US GDP growth is around 2.2 to 2.9% during the period. So this means that plastics industry is the consumption rate of plastics is 3 times the GDP growth rate and nearly 22 times the employment growth rate. It means that the industry itself is not bringing a lot of jobs to the US economy, considering the consumption growth. And let's take another example. In Rwanda. Rwanda is one of the first countries in the world to ban plastics bags and some single-use plastics. I believe since 2008, Juliet, I stand to be corrected. Rwanda has probably one of the lowest plastic production and consumption per capita. GDP annual growth rate for the decade prior to the pandemic is as high as 7.2%, and the post-pandemic growth rate is an impressive 10.9%, one of the fastest growing economies in the world. So the two countries' comparison show that plastic production and consumption is not necessarily conducive to economic growth and job employment, and at least it's not a must factor. And single-use plastics, if you think about it, were produced to reduce labor involvement in the economy. And it's actually, in a way, is to reduce the employment so that you can just use it and throw them away. In developing countries, the cheap costs of plastics can potentially crowd out local economies that use the ecological alternatives and materials that be made available locally. So my view in summary, I think, Magnus, we can demystify the relationship, and the countries, developing countries, shouldn't worry about potential impact of plastic reduction on their economy. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. That's extremely helpful. Thank you, Sulan. I also want to turn back to you, Tim, and of course the Environmental Investigation Agency that you represent here has been one of the strongest voices, I think, calling for reduction in the total production of virgin plastics for several years now, maybe even longer. But of course, for this to work, concrete obligations need to be adopted by states in the new treaty. And I do suspect, I may be wrong, but I do suspect that not all states and not even all stakeholders may be equally enthusiastic about reducing production of plastics. Based on the views that have been expressed so far, both at the first round of negotiations in Uruguay, but also now in the submissions that have been made to the second round of negotiations, do you think these measures, which we have a strong case for, but are they expected to attract sufficient support among states in these negotiations?
I'll do my best to answer that question. I would argue that there's broad support already, at least on certain aspects, and so I just would start there. In looking at the submissions, there are quite a many submissions. A very large number of countries recognize the need for reporting, a robust reporting framework. And they also sort of spoke directly to addressing virgin polymer production and consumption in some fashion. States seem to be much further along on the notion that we should eliminate problematic polymers. And that is a very good start. I think it's a recognition that supply side measures are required. And so I take that as a positive and part of the evolution that I think a lot of people's thinking proceeds along. And what we saw is a number of submissions and an emerging awareness that more is needed for the polymers that we do use. And I think that's the critical question being sort of presented to negotiators. Now, whether this is sufficient to support the number of submissions in countries that have expressed interest in reporting and elimination of problematic polymers, and as well as those that have expressed desire to have limits as well, whether this is sufficient in the context of treaty negotiations is to be determined. We still have a lot of negotiations ahead of us. But we've always taken the position, and I want to be very clear here, that we do not need to construct the entire house now. Rather, we should strive to construct the foundation and the frame and provide ourselves with the tools to complete it in the future in areas where we need, where we possibly need additional assessment, where we need to reach additional agreement. But if we have the foundation, the frame, and we have the tools, then we will have a living treaty that over time will evolve and be able to get at the issues progressively as the, I guess, awareness of the need to take action increases. And so this is why we've been very big supporters of the notion that we need to include mechanisms within the convention that will allow us to set limits in the future. We don't have all the answers now. We should certainly aim to have a freeze. I think that makes sense that we're already above sustainable levels. But where we go to reach sustainability is a question that I think will likely require a lot of further deliberation, perhaps deliberation that we will not be able to undertake within the context of the next 2 years. So we need the mechanisms to be able to set limits in the future without additional ratification via decision when we have comfort levels at the levels that we want to set these limits at. And so that would be, I think, the very, I wouldn't say ideal, because the lack of information is never ideal, but that would be a very responsive result given where we are and what we need, is to have a convention that can live on and be able to adopt limits in the future as awareness and information becomes available. I guess I will just end by saying it's to be decided. It's certainly a topic to be negotiated. We have strong champions like Rwanda, but many other countries as well have submitted views along the lines of what Rwanda has. And so we're hopeful that by having this issue on the table and being able to vet and sort through these problems with other countries, that we'll be able to reach some sort of agreement on a way forward that does allow us to do everything we want to do on virgin plastic production.
Thank you so much for that, Tim. And I actually want to just follow up with another question. I think that's very helpful, and it also addresses some other points made about the need for this treaty to provide mechanisms for gradual strengthening. That you start somewhere and then you introduce mechanisms to strengthen it over time. Just wanted to ask you another question that is also something that I believe you have been advocating, and which is written in your submission, and this, the role of fossil fuel subsidies in plastic production, and the extent to which this treaty should basically just regulate the production itself, or whether it should also seek to regulate the steps leading up to that production. How important is it, in your view, that this new treaty also addresses really the root causes of plastic pollution at the extraction phase?
I think it's extremely important, and we are very big advocates of the inclusion of a full life cycle approach. And while we sort of have targeted in the course of this conversation the moment in time in which plastic comes into existence as a material, and that's a very sort of important measure to have. There are a lot of measures that we envision would be required on the sourcing or the raw material aspect or the precursors. It is obviously challenging because oil and gas is pulled out of the ground for other reasons as well, and so it touches upon other end uses and other sectors. It then sort of goes through a process by which the sort of constituents are pulled out and separated, and we enter into the petrochemical phase. Petrochemicals are largely used for in two different sectors, to produce plastics and to produce fertilizers. And so at that point in time, we have a much more close nexus to plastic production. We know where some of these are destined. For example, that incident that happened in East Palestine was for a precursor to make PVC. It was an extremely unfortunate event that had a lot of toxic repercussions in the United States. And having controls on the precursors, on the raw materials, is something that we constantly talk about in the Montreal Protocol world. I'd like to see that here. I think is a very wise approach, so that we can also help sort of provide some level of support for our measures on virgin plastic production. So subsidies are one of them, but there's other things that we can do that are in our submission, and I would refer those who are interested to look at that. I will just take this moment to make one other comment, though. And I don't mean to be shocking or controversial or otherwise, but our biggest challenge in this treaty right now is trying to persuade the minds of plastic producers and the countries influenced by them that this is in their self-interest too. And we have a unique opportunity here, and I hope we don't squander it, but we need people to realize, again, plastic producers and the countries that are influencing them, that their businesses are not going to go away. And indeed, they have the potential to be quite profitable. And I know this may sound, weird, but it is true. So if you take the example of the Montreal Protocol or recent gas shortages, when supplies are reduced, demand lags or continues to exist, prices increases and profits are made. Now, I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing per se, but it is what it is. And so the producers of ozone depleting substances and hydrofluorocarbons realized this when we had the phase outs of ODS and HFCs. Gas producers are realizing this now with the shortages of gas that we have on the market. So in other words, a managed phase down to some sort of sustainable level is or can be perceived as good business. And so one of the main challenges that we have in sort of negotiating and codifying, as it were, these measures in the new treaty is sort of making people make that mental leap and realize that it's not the end, but that there is opportunity. And with this opportunity also comes the chance to no longer be a part of the problem, but to be a part of the solution and to sort of help us achieve the world that we want to live in. So we have challenges. We have those who I think see that, or maybe they're not the countries that are most closely involved with plastic production. But we need to get the plastic producers in the plastic producing countries on board with this mindset that this is actually not necessarily something that's going to hurt their bottom line. It's an opportunity, and an opportunity to then stand alongside with us and really address plastic pollution.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Tim. And with that, I'd really like to open for some questions from those of you in the audience. And we can both take live questions. Please just raise your hand. I see that some of you have already done that. We'll get to you in due course, but also by asking your questions in the Q&A box. And I see that many of you have already done that. So we'll start by fielding some of these questions to the best of my abilities. I see a lot of questions coming in, so I don't think we will get to all of them. We have a team that is working on clustering some of them, so we can hopefully answer as many as possible. And I would like to ask you first, Soo Lan, whether it's a concrete question to you, whether it will be possible to share the source of the data you juxtaposed between the US and Rwanda on the relationship between plastic production and consumption vis-a-vis economic growth.
Thanks, Magnus. The sources of data come from the OECD, and the report is called Global Plastics Outlook, but only one data from that. And then the data about the plastic industry comes from American Plastics Industry Association report. It's available online. You can Google that, American Plastics Industry Association report. And economic growth rate comes from the World Bank economic growth data sets. I'm happy to share later after the webinar.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. I'm sure that will be greatly appreciated. I also wanted, there are some questions here also about the relationship between plastic production and consumption on the one hand, and plastic pollution and climate change. And specifically, maybe this is something that you could address, Bethany, since I think you touched upon that briefly in your introductory remarks. Is a reduction in plastic production needed to stay within the Paris climate agreement and specifically the 1.5 degree target?
Well, to answer the first part of the question, there are clear connections between plastics and climate change. And that's based on the fact that the majority of plastics today are produced from fossil fuels, as we've heard a few times already. So there are connections to that, and release is already at the extractive phase of methane and other gases into the environment. Then when plastics degrade, they can degrade again into methane, and if they're fully degraded, which usually doesn't happen under most circumstances, to carbon dioxide. A lot of plastics are also incinerated, which is another source or route for release of greenhouse gases into the environment. And I don't know if you'll remember from my second slide, there are other connections between plastics and climate change through particles and changes in albedo and changes in carbon sequestration in, for example, the ocean pump. And we don't have all of the science there, but there are some indications that can be happening. Then to the next part of your question about solutions and whether we need to switch out plastics, I think, again, here we need to be mindful of regrettable substitutions. And that a number of people have mentioned in the questions I've seen, and it's been talked about here, that plastics are useful for some things. They are lightweight, flexible materials. So they did help us reduce, from the beginning at least, was argued at least, that they helped us reduce, for example, fuel costs and transportation. But we need to really have a look at if we are replacing plastics with some other materials, that we're not replacing it with something regrettable, and that we are creating systems that help us stay within our climate goals without increasing plastics production. I think that's really important to say.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And if I could just quickly field another question to you right away, Bethany. This relates to the sort of material composition of different types of plastics. And, you know, there may be, we may not have all the information about what these products actually contain in terms of chemicals, for instance.
Very rarely do we have all the information. I would say almost never.
Yeah, exactly. So what do we have to do to make sure that we get that information? Because we need information before we can regulate, right?
Yeah, I think I would really like to see that the treaty includes transparency requirements, that we know what is going into the products. And this would be throughout the life stage, because plastics move through value change and through different actors, and different actors might be adding different chemicals, different pigments, epoxy lim, glues, labels, inks, and so on. So we need to know what's happening throughout the product's life stage from the very, very first steps. And we don't have access to that information now. Once we do have that, we can better understand potential problems with plastics, but we could also simplify, and again, back to this word minimize, what the market looks like. So we can have a fewer number of polymers. I think Tim and some others said that we should start banning toxic polymers. Some plastics are more toxic than others because of the additives or because of their monomers, molecular structure. And then we can also look at chemicals. We need to reduce the chemical footprint of plastics. We need to simplify the products that we have and make sure that what we are using is safe and sustainable and reusable, recyclable, and so on. So I would really like to see transparency requirements all the way right through the whole value chain of plastics.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for addressing that question, Bethany. We also have a question here that I'd like to field to you, Ed. And it's a person in the audience who agrees fully that reducing production and consumption of all plastics is important. Also make a point about the connection with the Paris Climate Agreement as well, that we just discussed now. But it seems like the only industry concerned are consumer goods when textile, construction and transport, among others, are also being big users of plastics. Maybe Ed, I could ask you to ask if some of these other non-consumer goods sectors, to what extent do we see any engagement and action from them, including maybe within the business coalition that you're a leading part of?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think certainly we've seen the most engagement so far from the value chain involved in consumer goods. And obviously we know that plastic packaging is one of the significant causes of plastic pollution, which is why we're seeing that correlation. I would also say, I think the consumer goods industry is where we've seen the most kind of voluntary commitment and voluntary action so far. Unilever, for example, set commitments in 2017, and the global commitment became quite widespread in 2018. But as a business coalition, we are looking at businesses across the whole value chain. So it's not just brand owners and retailers. We also have waste management companies, we have plastic producers, and we increasingly have financial institutions. So those actually that are playing a role within the investment needed into the new system that we need to design. But as a business coalition, we're very open. If you have connections or ideas of those that would want to come and get engaged in our work, there are no fees to joining the business coalition. You simply have to endorse the vision statement that's on our website that includes this important language around reduction of plastic production and use. But I think what we'll start to see is, and I think Tim said it earlier, that within the treaty context, starting with the things that we know are practical and we know we can do now, I think that's where in the consumer goods industry, we have a lot of these practical examples already. And perhaps in some of these other industries, there is more progress to be made. But as I said, we're very open as a business coalition to inviting others as long as they're aligned with the vision that we've set out.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for addressing that question, Ed. And I'd now like to open for questions from the floor as well. And I see a hand from Ram Sa, and also one from Mohammed Yerima Bala here in the box. So I'll give the floor first to Ram Sa. Please introduce yourself and your affiliation, and please, if possible, direct your question to a specific panelist. Please, Ram Sa, you have the floor.
Thank you, Magnus. I'm Ram Charitra Shah from Center for Public Health and Environmental Development, CFED, Nepal, from mountainous high mountain countries. My question is, like, all the discussion behind this production, consumption, and related to plastic is ultimately to clean the overburden of plastic pollution. I see the great connection between upstream and downstream plastic pollution, and being a citizen of mountainous country and country with the highest peak of the world, there are a number of studies now clearly showing that even microplastic has been found in snow and ice sampling collected from over 8,000 meters from mean sea levels, meaning high mountain, like peak of the world, mountain ice has the microplastic pollution in it. So my question is, until and unless we clean upstream, downstream cannot be cleaned. So my further question is, how and what are the mechanism upcoming UN plastic treaty is going to take or foresee to make sure that upstream plastic pollution should be cleaned so that the downstream will be much cleaner as we expected? So that is my first question. The second question, we have done a lot of number of studies on recycling plastic, and one study we have done on children toy, and we have clearly seen the toy found in our Nepalese market have elevated level of penta-BD, octa-BD, which is non-POPs, banned POPs chemical, but it is found in the product which is reaching to our future generation hand and mouth sometimes while playing. So how we can ensure stopping recycling of those plastic which is known to be or found to be toxic? So in name of circularity, every plastic should not be recycled or should not be recommended for recycling. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question, Ram. I would suggest that we take a couple of more questions before we turn back to the panelists. But thank you so much. And I'll give the floor to Mohammed Yerima Bala for his question. Mohammed, you have the floor.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
My name is Mohammed Yerima Bala. I'm a CEO of Yerima Bala International Education, Nigeria. I'm from Federal Republic of Nigeria. And my question is specifically on Paris Agreement of 2015. And about 196 countries gathered in Paris in 2015 and have signed an agreement on adaptation and mitigation on climate change. And accidentally, one of the influence countries, like United States of
Mohammed, I think we lost your connection.
So my question here.
Mohammed, could you just repeat your last sentence? Your connection seems to be breaking up a bit.
Okay, my question is based on Paris Agreement of 2015. And we all know that 196 countries have signed the Treaty on Climate Change in 2015. United States of America have pulled out from the Paris Agreement. And if we all know that they are financial in this process. And my question is that, what are the, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Thank you very much.
Your question.
Yes, my question is that, what are the, emphasis that United Nations are putting in implementing the Paris Agreement of 2015? What are the emphasis the United Nations are putting to make sure that each of every country that have signed the treaty or the agreement of Paris 2015 are working very hard? What are the emphasis they have put toward the actualizing of this agreement, most especially in African countries? We are suffering from this climate change. It has a great effect in our economic development. So I want to know, what are the emphasis United Nations have put to make sure that African countries and Asia have put in actualizing the agreement of Paris 2015? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that question. We'll take one last question before returning to the panelists. I would now like to give the floor to Omoyemen Lucia Odigia, who will have a question. Please introduce you quickly and ask your question. Please be brief, because we only have 12 minutes left of the meeting.
Good day, colleagues. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Yes, my concern, I want to raise two issues. My concern is about the need to create incentives for sustainable alternatives for plastic instead of plastics, and then to also remove subsidies in respect of new initiatives that new investments in manufacturing of plastics. Now, at the local level, a lot of people are dependent on plastics because, like my colleague who just spoke, raised toys, all sorts of easy use for local people come from plastic products. So when we advocate for people to give up single-use plastics, they want to know what kind of incentive. For instance, in Nigeria, if you buy as much as a pure water, just water in sachet that is less than, it's like 100 or more of $1, you will get a plastic bag where that is put. And a lot of local people depend on this kind of bags and all other kinds of plastic products, including toys. Now, when we advocate for single-use plastics especially, and to phase out plastic, they want to know what kinds of incentive can be created by governments. And so I'm thinking that in respect of these instruments, we should be thinking of what kind of incentive can states be made to commit to in respect of creating sustainable alternatives to plastics, and what kind of subsidies have to be reduced in respect of manufacturing. And now it's not just enough to make provisions in the convention, but there must be a mechanism for compliance and enforcement. So my question is, what is your opinion on the need for incentives to outbalance subsidies, and the needs, and what kind of mechanism for implementation, compliance, and enforcement will be effective to achieve the goal we seek? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so very much for that question. I would now like to return to the panel. And if you would like to address any of these questions, please do raise your hand. If you don't, I may call on either of you, because I certainly don't know how to answer these questions as well as you do. Thankfully, I see Bethany, you have your hand raised. Please, you have the floor.
Yeah, I think I can start us off, and I'll address the science parts of the questions. So first off, regarding microplastics, definitely we see microplastics on every niche in every environment on the entire planet. There is no place left on the planet that is clean. So that includes the high mountaintops, as we heard from Nepal, and the deepest of the deepest oceans, and as Sulan mentioned earlier, even human bodies. So microplastics are everywhere, and once they are in the micro size, we can't clean them up, or it would require very advanced technologies to clean them up. So essentially, we can't clean them up. What we do need to do is work upstream, as the speaker indicated, and we need to make sure that the plastics are not in the environment. We can try to clean up larger plastic bits before they become microplastics, which become uncatchable for us. So cleaning up the plastics in the environment, working with remediation, is definitely an issue, but we should move upstream and make sure the plastics don't get to the environment in the first place. And the second part of that question was regarding toys. And I've also worked on toys, and yes, there are harmful chemicals in toys all over the world, definitely more in some parts of the world than others. Some of that is tied to regulations. And we've seen in Europe, at least, that it is possible to use regulations to ban uses of some kinds of chemicals in toys. We saw that with phthalates, which are softeners, and short-chain chlorinated paraffins, which were removed from toys on the European market following legislation. What our study did not address, and what I don't know, is what those chemicals were replaced with. So we don't know if there was a regrettable substitution there. Hopefully not. But this is something that we can look at. It is possible to write laws that ban chemicals in certain kinds of products that can make those products more protective and safer for humans. And children are definitely among the most sensitive of us. They're developing their organ systems, their brains, their hormone systems are under development, and they are more sensitive to chemical exposures than adults are, most definitely. So and toys are very important to consider, among other things. And
Brilliant.
With that, I'll pass off to another speaker.
Thank you so much for that, Bethany, for addressing those two questions. And I think also the question about the children toys, and also the question that we had about the Paris Agreement, it's a broader question here about enforcement and ensuring implementation of commitments or obligations once they have been agreed upon. I was just actually wanted to call upon you, Tim, and sorry for putting you on the spot, but maybe to ask you to reflect upon how can we, through this treaty, build in mechanisms to ensure or incentivize implementation of commitments once undertaken.
Yeah, I'll do my best. So I, as I mentioned before, I've been a practitioner at the Montreal Protocol level for over 15 years. And, we there have a compliance mechanism, or an implementation compliance mechanism. And we've also seen something along the lines come out in the Minamata Convention, although it's still in the early days of that convention. By and large, what we've come to realize is that we need to be facilitative of compliance and not punitive. compliance is a difficult undertaking. Obviously, it relates to the obligation and things that are happening at the local and national level unlawfully. And so it's a challenge for any country, regardless of their commitments at the international level. But it's a work in progress, and countries need to have the comfort level to come forward to identify challenges that they face in coming into compliance in certain illegal activity, and have a constructive forum that helps to bring them back into compliance. And that's one way I sort of envision constructing this convention, if I had the pen, is creating that process to know that it is a work in progress and that there will be hiccups along the way. We at the Montreal Protocol, widely considered the most successful environmental treaty in the land, we had a major issue with illegal ODS production, CFC 11, and we spent the time working with the party implicated in getting out the information, understanding the needs, and trying to be responsive to the actions that were taken and supportive of them. That's how I would see us constructing an implementation and compliance mechanism here, just in full recognition that nothing comes out of the gates perfectly, and it takes time. It takes time to sort of change the bureaucratic culture. It takes time to change the industrial culture, and it takes time to ensure that what we put into place is always 100% fully complied with. So that's how I would sort of answer that question, and it's in the context of the treaty. I just want to also kind of just quickly touch upon one of the earlier points that were raised. We're here talking about, I guess, upstream measures and virgin polymer production and consumption and what we should do there. And a lot of the comments, or some of the comments, came out and talking about the downstream impacts and implications. And I just want to sort of make the observation, because it's so relevant here, that we cannot see these in isolation, that they really need to be constructed and crafted with both in mind. So, for example, we cannot put onto the market plastics that we can't recycle in the end. We need criteria that align so that when we capture and collect it and shred it, we can put it back into the economy in a similar use with the confidence that it doesn't have legacy chemicals that are going to harm our children. And so while we're talking about specific stages of the life cycle, it can't be divorced from the criteria and the elimination of chemicals that we're going to need along the entire supply chain. Obviously, we need to start somewhere, and I think starting here makes sense, but it really needs to be an iterative process as well on the back end. So just thought I would raise that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for addressing those aspects, and also that first tricky question about compliance, implementation, and enforcement. Thank you, Tim. We're actually running out of time, but I wanted also to field that last question that we got about how we, through this treaty, can incentivize the development of sustainable alternatives. And I was wondering if you, Sue Lan, would be willing to take a crack at that question.
Thank you so much, Magnus. And we recognize the transition to a plastic pollution-free economy would have some challenges and obstacles, but we have seen inspiring examples from developing countries. So I would say you never know until you do it. And it's not as difficult probably, because we have seen in what happens in Rwanda, Kenya, Tanzania, and a few African countries are following the suit, and also keeping in mind your other economic returns in terms of fisheries sector, tourism, and living in a clean and healthy environment. So I think for the treaty to be effective, we need to invest also in awareness raising, not only at the global level, but also going down to the local and community level. Really look very carefully and be mindful about the consumption and the cost and benefits. Over. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Sue Lan. And I think this has been a really interesting and rich discussion. We could have continued much longer, I think, looking at all the questions that we have received, and unfortunately we won't be able to give the floor to everybody. I just wanted, before I close the meeting, just wanted to ask the person who framed our whole discussion, Juliet, if you, Juliet, would like to share some concluding reflections after having heard this discussion. it doesn't seem to be the case, which is no problem. It's totally fine. So with that, I would just like, we are then going to be able to close on time. I think that this discussion that we have here is a bit of a sort of a snapshot. These are ongoing discussions. They are that are going on in many circles, and they will continue and intensify both in the run-up to the next meeting of the Intergovernmental Negotiation Committee in Paris in a couple of months. It starts at the end of May, but also throughout these years that this negotiation process will take place. And I think this discussion will also help us, hopefully, prepare. I would like to give a shout out and a big thank you to colleagues, particularly Ingrid Arendal, who has helped organize today's event. It's really great that we get a chance to meet like this, to prepare for Paris and share our thoughts. So thank you, Lars, in particular to you and other colleagues there. And finally, please note that there will be another event in this format already next week. We only discussed, of course, today as sort of a subset, maybe an important subset, but still a subset of the provisions that have been proposed included in the new treaty on plastic pollution. We also touched upon some of the other provisions and how they interrelate, but on next week, on Wednesday, the 22nd of March, from 10 o'clock to 11:30 Central European time, we will have an event to discuss more concretely proposed provisions to increase circularity of plastics in the economy. So please stay tuned for that next event. That was on Wednesday, the 22nd of March, from 10 o'clock to 11:30 Central European time, and really hope to see many of you back for that. So with that, I'll close the session. Big thanks and a virtual round of applause to our excellent speakers. Thanks also to all of you in the audience. Farewell and see you next week.